Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here today. You are in the right place. If you are here for our webinar on DRC Revisited Part 2, my name is Paul Taubman, and I'll be the presenter for today. We have a ton of things to go through, so I am going to really just jump straight into it here. This is, these are the objectives for today. We're going to talk about the method of creating rules, and half of this presentation today is going to go into these methods. So in addition to showing you the tools, I'm also going to talk about queries. I'm going to try to do as much as I can with the queries with the time that I've got. I do have a polling question for you later on specific to queries that I'll be curious to get more information about. But until then, we'll talk about queries. There's a few special rule cases I will talk about. And what I mean by special rules are things that you may want to know about when you're trying to make rules. One of them is what I call the regional rule, or this is basically using a room so that you can create a specific rule within a certain area. And also want to talk about this thing called impoly versus ispoly. This one is something that trips up a lot of people, and I think I've got an okay explanation to kind of sort that out for you. The other half of our presentation today is going to be on classes. Originally, I thought this would be pretty straightforward and simple. Classes can be pretty simple, but there's a lot of other things that we can do, and I'm also going to show you a couple of hints and tips on the schematic side of things, because a lot of times we do some stuff in the PCB, then we do a change in the schematic, and then we do an ECO over and we crush those things that we set up in the PCB. So I want to give you some hints and tips on to avoid doing those type of things. All right, one piece of housekeeping. Unfortunately, I will not have time for questions today. We've got a whole hour of presentation for you. However, my good colleague, Tom Cassidy, is listening in here, and he is also one of our panelists, so he is going to be able to help me out with questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to write them in at any time, and Tom will give some assistance to that. And of course, if we can't answer it here today, or Tom can't answer it, we'll certainly put together a Q&A sheet. And speaking of which, I do want to bring this up to you. Last month, we did our first part of this webinar recording. It is now up and available to you, but there is also a Q&A to take a look at. You guys asked some really great questions. I spent quite a bit of time doing some research on some of these questions over here. So please do take advantage of this information. And I'll probably put together another one of these based off of your questions as well. So just feel free to write those questions at any time. I do have a polling question for you, and we're going to start that off over here. So why don't we kick that one off? So the question here is, do you use the PCB filter often? Wow, this is a really interesting poll. I didn't expect that. So we've got actually a very interesting distribution here. So there's some who use it quite often. That's almost like a third almost across the way. And then there are a few people who are saying, what's that? For those 10% of the people who are saying, what's that? You're definitely going to learn about it here today. I do have one other polling question for you. If you are using the filter panel, what are you primarily using it for? Okay, so a good portion of you are already using it for finding and selecting, and that is certainly what its primary purpose is for today. And the cool part about it is that what you're going to find very quickly is that not only can you find and select with it, but it can also help you to create rules. So for those who are probably doing both A and B, there's 17% of you here. You've already caught on to where I'm going with this here today. All right, with that being said, I have a couple of thoughts on queries, and then we're going to jump into Altium Designer. Queries have four primary purposes in the PCB editor, and you may have found another one, but these are the big four that I have found, and of that, three of them are probably the most applicable to this conversation today. You can use it to find things, and by the way, finding things simply means that it's just being highlighted. Selecting things, which means it actually is being selected so that you can do additional edits or perform another editing feature on it, or you can actually apply a rule to it as well. And the fourth one is this thing called is scripting, of course. And I don't want to get into it too much, but the reason I do bring up scripting is because there are a ton of queries out there. And one of the ones that I found kind of intriguing, since there's so many of them, is one called the is rule. And I spent quite a bit of time on this in preparation for this webinar here today. And to be perfectly honest with you, when everything's said and done, the only thing I could conclude was that these queries were for scripting. I even contacted a former colleague of mine at Altium and asked him if he had ever seen these before, and he really had said no, nobody's ever seen them. The only thing I ever found in the forums about them was somebody used it, but the is rule is basically a Boolean, and they used it in an equation, which seems to me like it wouldn't work, and they used it for a purpose which has been long since remedied through Altium's improvements over time. So just as a side note, if you've ever used the is rule outside of a scripting, I'd certainly like to know how you used it. But what I'm trying to bring, the point I'm trying to bring here is there's a lot of queries out there, and a good portion of them may not be applicable. So if you've seen that list, and I'll show you the whole list here in a little bit, don't get overwhelmed by all the sheer number of queries. I'd say out of all of them, maybe 10% of them can get 100% of your work done. The other thing to keep in mind about a query is that it's really just a classic if-then statement, okay? And the if is really this box that you have to type in the query, the then is the result of it. And of course, if you're using the PCB filter panel, that then is really selecting something that is there. And of course, in the purpose of a rule, if that is true, then a rule is being applied to something. So think of it always as an if-then without actually having to write the if and the then. There are really also two just different types of queries out there. There is the Boolean type, which is true, false, and those are the easiest ones to use. So if you type in is_pad in the filter panel, then it's going to select those things that are true and mask out those things that are not true. There are other ones that are expressions, and those expressions do require something to compare against or additional information. So for example, trace length, it can't work unless you give it something to test against, like something being greater than 15, or in component. Well, which component do you want? You have to give it something very specific. So that's the way you can really boil down some of these queries. It's either a Boolean or it's going to be some type of expression. And that's all I've got it here on this. Let's get into Altium Designer because I want to show you a bunch of things here. We're going to probably pick up where we kind of left off in the last webinar here. So we're looking at the same design again. I have turned off the errors, so I've gone into tools and the reset error marks over here, okay? And in addition to that, I've also shelved all the polygons. I think it'll just make it a little bit easier as we zip around over here as we're going through this. What I'd like to do is I want to spend some time in the PCB filter, because if you really understand how this works, you can do a lot with queries. And the first one I'm going to show you here is this thing called the query helper. Now, in terms of an editor, I don't care for it that much, only because generally speaking, if you don't know how to do the syntax correctly, it's not necessarily going to help you with that. It will, if you have the syntax wrong, you can click on the syntax, it'll say it's wrong, but it won't tell you why it is wrong. In the past, they would give you a few more pop-up hints, but I don't really see those like I used to. So if I type in like within room, the keyword will pop up, but it doesn't give me, something's trying to pop up over here, but it keeps getting blocked. So in terms of actually doing typing up the queries, I don't find this to be as useful as maybe it could be, but nevertheless, there are other places where we can do this, and the PCB filter has kind of picked up a lot of that slack where the query helper has kind of fallen off. But nevertheless, the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is that every type of attribute that Altium recognizes is listed over here. And you can see these up here in the PCB functions. I'll talk about these here in just a moment. There's also system functions too. They're primarily for mathematical expressions. And there is one I'll show you that I think is really useful that does use a mathematical expression. But let me jump back up here. What Altium is trying to do with these queries is trying to categorize them. And I'm going to be honest with you, I think it's a tough job that they have here, because there's a lot of grayscale that they're dealing with when, shades of gray, shall we say, that they're dealing with when they try to put them into these different categories. But generally speaking, the way they broke these down was that the first set is object types. So what you're looking for are those things that have something or is something. In fact, you see the prefixes over here, they have has and is. Now in the past, when I was looking into this, you will see has and is in these other fields here as well. So it's not like the object types are only going to be is or has in there. It's just that these are just looking for very specific things. They usually have to do with the primitive themselves, like is arc or is board or is blind via, and maybe jumping around a little bit over here, but that's what it's looking for. And a good number of these you probably will never use. There's your is rules over here that I was curious about and discussed earlier. There's also fields in here. Those fields to me look like properties. So if there's specific properties of something that you want to find, you can make use of these as well. There are membership checks. Now, I want to talk a thing about membership checks. First and foremost, attribute checks and membership checks to me are really fuzzy. I almost think you put them all in the same area. They talk about objects here, and then they talk about primitives over here. But in looking up the the definition of an object and primitive, there may be an official definition between the two, but it's kind of hard because when you read what Altium puts out there, they use the term primitive and object synonymous with each other. So let me take a step back over here and let's take a look at the membership check and explain what it's trying to do here. There are primitives in Altium Designer, like your track, your arc, your component. And then there are those primitives that have primitives in them, like a component, a polygon pore, a class. Even a class is considered primitive even though it doesn't have a graphical representation to it. Even a room has primitives in it. So you have primitives of primitives. And what these membership checks are trying to do is trying to determine if one of those primitives happens to be in I'll call a parent primitive, such as a component or a room or a polygon pore. And that takes me to another point over here, which I talked about in the objectives. There are, and they put it, it's kind of weird how they do it. Under membership checks, they do in component over here. And in the attribute checks, they do in poly over here. And they really are kind of the same thing. So there's in poly and in polygon. When you're creating a rule, and let's say you want to have a rule that's specific to a polygon, and you say, hey, I want a clearance rule that says if I have this trace and I have this polygon, I want a certain clearance. Well, if you say is polygon, it won't work, even though that sounds right, because is polygon basically saying if this is a polygon, then run it against this. But a polygon is actually one of these examples of a primitive within primitives within a primitive. And so in a polygon pore, it actually is using either fields or regions or traces or arcs in order to create what you see as a polygon. Now, this is not as obvious when you're doing a solid polygon, but it's much more obvious if you did like a hatched polygon, for example. So that is why, and by the way, Altium makes it very clear if you look in the rules query that if you are going to do something like a component clearance rule and you want it to be up against a polygon, you can't use is poly or is polygon. By the way, they're synonymous with each other. You have to use in polygon because it has to do with the primitives within the polygon itself. And by the way, the same thing happens with rooms as well. When I was doing some experiments and getting ready for this, I was going to try to use is room, and the query did not work because it was not about the room, it was about those things that were in the room in order for the query to properly work. So I wanted to bring that up since we were talking about these here. So that's the big difference between in poly and is poly, and same thing with in component versus is component. The easiest thing to do is if it's not working for you, and I'll talk more about this here in a moment, try it out in the PCB filter panel first. If you can select in the PCB filter panel, then more than likely the rule will be valid for you. So that's what you can look at here. And then of course, as I mentioned, there's attribute checks in here. And you may say, well, what about in BGA? Why don't they use is BGA? Because in BGA, Altium can look at different things in order to try to determine if it is a BGA. For example, it can look at its properties, in particular text properties, maybe something like in the comment, or it can look at its configuration, the actual configuration of it, to determine if it is a BGA. So that's why they say in BGA as opposed to is BGA. Another area which I think is going to become more fruitful here now and in the future is this parameters attribute. And the reason why is because in the past, in Altium Designer 17 and prior, if you were using the parameters in the schematic, the only parameter that would go over from the schematic side to the PCB side is the comment field. And we always told people in the past, look, whatever you put in the description field, put it in the comment field, so at least you can see what the description is on the PCB layout side. But with Altium Designer 18, you can actually see all of the parameters now. So if I go click on some part over here, let's make sure I am cleared. So let's zoom over here and click on a part. And if we go over here to the parameters on the properties panel, and I have it set up here on the right side, you'll see all the parameters that came in from the symbol. Now you can't edit these, which I think is great, but Lead can now see them, which I think is a huge advantage. So I don't have to go flipping back and forth between the schematic docs and the PCB docs. But now that they've got these in here, then the use of parameter queries makes a whole lot more sense. So let me go back over here to the helper panel again. So you may want to take advantage of these type of queries. Of course, there are layout checks here as well based off of the different layers. The PCB Objects List, these are simply objects that you have available to you for this particular project. So obviously, when you are doing another project, these are not going to be available to you because you're going to have another net list that you're going to be working with another set of components. And as I mentioned earlier on, you have the system functions as well. So if you need to take a look for a particular type of query, you can certainly look in here. They'll give you a brief description of it. Sometimes, like one's missing or it may not make a whole lot of sense, you will have to go online to take a look. I always encourage people to, if you're going to do this, type in the word query, type in the actual query that you're looking for, type in Altium Designer. If you do this in a Google search, more than likely you'll pull it up pretty quickly is in the search results. So just a way to take a look at it. That's all I want to talk about here in the helper. Let's talk about some of the things in the filter panel down below because these are all important things to know. And then we'll get into some of the query examples that they've got up here on the top. We talked about the helper here. I'll talk about the build and the create rule here in a few minutes. There is history and there's a favorite. So every time you type something in here, and you apply it, it becomes a part of the history. And if I click on the history here, it's going to bring up the expression manager. You'll notice that favorites is here, history is up here. So if I want to take something that I like a lot, like this one I was playing with just before the webinar, and I want to add it to the favorites, I can do that. So it makes it a little bit more permanent. Whereas these will roll off over time. I believe Altium will basically keep the last 50 queries. And by the way, it'll also keep any query, whether it was a good query or a bad query. So just be aware of that over here. But you can see all those things that I've been trying here throughout the preparation for this webinar. There is also, as I said, the favorites, and the favorites does maintain those that you want to use over and over again. And as a matter of fact, let me go over here. The favorites and the history are the same. Basically, it brings up the same dialogue. It's just that here now the favorites tab has been brought up rather than the history one. And here in the favorites, if I want to pick one, and I'll pick this one here, I can rename it, edit it, remove it. So of course, if I want to call this something a little bit better, I can certainly rename it. I'm also going to do this one called apply expression here. And you can see, and the reason I want to bring this one up because it's a really great example of a query that actually uses mathematical formula here. And by the way, the other reason I bring it up too is because it is one of the default ones that you get in Altium. So if you go into Altium Designer and you just started using the history, you'll actually find it as one of the default history options that they give you. The reason I like this one over here is because it's actually very practical. What it does over here is the equation is looking for those things that are really small, those little stubs. And you may want to actually run something like this because the rules won't catch something like this. Like in this situation over here, these little things don't bother us from a layout point of view because they're all electrically the same, but these do cause issues with Gerber files in particular because it's asking for double exposure. So you may want to actually run something like this and then delete those little extra pieces in there, and they'll certainly help out those folks doing the CAM work. Of course, be careful too that you don't delete an actual trace when you're doing those type of things here. But that's what this whole equation was all about, was to assist with something that the rule set really can't assist with, and that is finding these little stubs underneath these pads, which they happen quite often when we do a route. We continue the route, we click into the route, it doesn't end it, and then we continue, and then we end the route, and that's how we get the stub in there. So there's your favorites, there's your histories. If you want to add to favorites, so you have one that you did here and you really like it, you don't have to do a copy and paste and open favorites. You just click on add to favorites and boom, they added it in there and you're good to go. The one disadvantage to this, I know this is going to be a question, can you save this off and use it in a later edition? The answer is no. It's been something that's been asked for at least the last decade. I wish Altium would address it. I did look on the forums this past week, and from what I could see, someone figured out a way to maybe manipulate the registry edit so that it will always go back to this particular file. I'm not keen on messing with my registries, but if you're one of those no guts, no glories with your PC, you may want to take a look on the forums and see if that will work for you. But generally speaking, there is just no save and load feature for this. That's just one of the big disadvantages of using the favorites. I'm going to close that out over here. We have our classic select, zoom, deselect, and mask. Hopefully you've seen these things. I'll go through them just very, very quickly. The difference between select and turning this off is that if I do ask for something like a text here, so I'll click on text and I'll do apply to all, what it's going to do here is it's going to highlight it and it's going to mask those things that are not applicable here, but it's not actually selecting it. Okay. As opposed to if I turn on the select here and do apply all, then these things have now been selected, and I can possibly do some type of edit to whatever I've selected. Side note here, hopefully you've seen this already, in Altium Designer 18 and moving forward, the inspector panel, which allowed you to do group edits, is no longer there. What Altium has done has pretty much taken the properties panel, which used to be a dialog, and they've turned it into a panel, but they've also combined the capability of global edits. So when you notice up over here in the properties, what they're showing over here are those things that are specific to text, and of course there's stars over here because everything's a little bit different. But if you want to do a global edit, you could actually do it right here in the properties, since these are all selected. So that's what happened to the inspector panel, and that's just a side note there. You can also use apply to selected over here. So if you have something that has already been selected, but you realize you selected a little too much and you wanted to somehow thin it out a little bit, you can do that. And I'll give another example to this. So let's say, for instance, I do is component. So I'm going to select this and I'm going to do apply all here. And now it selects all my components. But let's say, well, I was actually thinking I wanted my through hole components. So I can go here, is through, and I say, here's my is through components, and I'll say apply to selected. So I'll only apply this to those that have already been selected, and it finds those things that have been selected. So that's the difference between the apply all and apply selected. The zoom feature, there was a lot of questions about this in the last webinar, and so I spent a lot of time on this here. The zoom feature is pretty much driven by the PCB panel here, and it's driven by the zoom level. So however you set this up in the PCB panel is what is going to drive it in the PCB filter. I don't like having reliance of panels on panels like that, but that's just the way they've done it. So if you're having some issues with it, look at the PCB panel to modify your zoom. So I have it in pretty close. So if, for example, I decide that I want to, let's see if I can find something that would zoom me in a bit. So if I want, for example, let me zoom this one out just so you can see it over here. If the zoom was out far, then it would just leave it where it was at. If I do an apply to all here, then it zooms me in accordingly. And if it was smaller, it would zoom me in even further. So that's the whole idea between the zoom. The deselect here could be to your advantage. Here's an example of this. So let's say, for instance, we said it is track, and we say apply all. So it does select all the tracks, plus those things that are actually on the silk layer as well. But for our argument right now, let's say I just want all the tracks, and I realize I want the arcs as well. So I'm going to turn off the deselect here, and then I'll say is arc, and I'll select that, and I'll say apply to all. So now, even though it pushes it into a mass form, these things are still highlighted, so it has accumulated the selections of those over here. So I prefer they didn't do that, remove the highlight part, but so be it. But they are still selected. So I'm going to do a clear here, and we'll go back to this. Hopefully I've given you a pretty good understanding of these features here. You've hopefully seen these already in other tools. Obviously the PCB filter does the same thing, and even some of the tools in the schematic editor like the Navigator has similar features as well. With that, I want to jump up over here to this interesting matrix that they have put together. I think they did this a couple of years ago. In the past, it used to just be this blank area that you typed in and you kind of made the best of it. What they're doing up over here is they're saying, look, we'll give you the common primitives, but we'll also give it to you in different contexts. So things like components or component bodies or rooms, the reason why there's nothing over here under net or components, because as I mentioned earlier on, there are components, and then there are primitives or objects, and there are those things that are objects of objects. And a component generally has other primitives in it, and the room is the same way. Even polygons are the same way as well. So you don't really ever have a component of component. You can have a union, but it's a different creature. What we're talking about is a component that has traces or has primarily pads in it. It could have something on the silk layers and so on and so forth. So that's why they're doing this the way they're doing it. And if you just click into one of these checkboxes here, it's going to start putting these things together for you. Of course, you have to click on it again. It'll bring it back to its default, which is not all. But I think where it gets more interesting is when you start looking at what these are trying to do here. The first column is talking about if it has a net association, because all these things that are listed here, with the exception of the VIA, well, even the VIA, pardon me, take that back. The VIA would have this as well. They all have nets. I was thinking designators. But all of these things over here would have some type of net association. So if I only wanted to select those things that were tracks that had some type of net associated with them, I could do that here. And I can click on this. You'll see it says is track, and they purposely put this in here because they don't, excuse me, they don't want to confuse it with anything in a polygon pour. And then there's a special query called in any net, and this in any net says you can select this as long as a real net has been associated with it. If it has something called no net, then it's not going to select it. So if we do apply all here, notice now that none of these tracks that were on the silk have been selected because they are no nets, but everything else here that is on either the basically the top or the bottom layer, it's only a 2-layer board, have been now selected. And so that's what they're trying to do over here. The other column here is if it's in something that is in a component. So a really good example of this one would be text. And if I do apply to all on this one here, you can see that all the text that was basically your designators are those things that got selected here. The 9-dot connects here, or the mute, mode, start, stop, and the on, off. These are things we added in afterwards, so they're not going to get selected because they're considered to be free. But I can always turn that on. So if I want to add those in there, it's going to accumulate that. So you can see is text, or pardon me, is free. And of course, sometimes it does a little bit of an, well, I guess it should put some parentheses over here. So is text and is free, or is text in any component. And if I do apply to all, these now get turned on as well. So the cool part about this is that you can play with this, and as you play with it, you can start seeing some of the constructs that you can make use of. And the two thoughts that I have with you is this: when it comes to this type of, when it comes to trying to figure out the queries, one of them is a challenge. And the one challenge I'm going to make to you is this: it's really easy to go in here and select something. But if you want to learn the query language, the best thing that you can do for yourself is to actually try to see if you can get it to come up through the filter panel. And yeah, maybe sometimes you may use some of the checkboxes over here, but the more and more you play with this over here, the better you're going to get with the queries on this. And as I mentioned earlier, the thing that's really cool about this is that if I have something that I know that works, I do apply all and it selects what I want it to do, then it's really just a matter of me creating a rule for this. And so I can certainly make use of that as well. And by the way, to create the rule, it's just a matter of having whatever you want over here. And actually, I'll create a rule here in a minute. I'll do what's called the within rule. Give me a moment to build on this, to talk about this create rule. But that's the intention that I want to make, is that if you, or state here, is that if you build something here in the filter and you're able to select it, you can create a rule off of it. And you know it's going to work. All too often, by the way, I've made this mistake for years. You go into design, you go into rules, you go ahead and you turn on a new rule, you try to make it work, it's not working, you keep going back to the rule set to try to make it work. And it may work, but if you start here in the filter panel first and you know you can select it, then you have a good shot at that rule actually being applicable. So that's something to keep in mind. Before I go into the builder here, there's one other way to create queries, and I'll bring that here, and that's the find similar objects. I'm going to clear out of this. The find similar objects to me is a really, really useful tool because it can help you with some of the most esoteric queries that you could ever come up with. So let's say, for instance, in fact, I'm going to zoom in over here to this little pad. I want to create a rule for a pad. And of course, the biggest problem I have with a pad, pardon me, it's not a pad, a via. Let me make that very clear. I want it for a via. The biggest problem I have with a via is it has no designator to it. So I have to, if I'm going to create a rule for a via, most of the time I've got to create it based off of some type of property of the via. In the find similar objects, hopefully you've seen this before, but it's basically you find a representation of what you want to create for the query or for the rule, and you select it, and you right click on it. And anytime you right click, look towards the top, 90% of the time it's going to be at the very top of the list. Find similar objects, it's in all 4 of the editors. And if it's not at the top, it's going to be the second or the third from the top. We're going to click on this here. Now, based off of this primitive I've selected, it's going to assist me with trying to find those things that are similar to it. And the first, in fact, the first column that you see here are all of those things that are specific to a via. I can't select something different. I can't look for a piece of, I can't look for text. I can't look for a component. I have to use a via because that's what I selected. If I want something different like an arc, I do find similar objects. Well, now I've got the properties for an arc. So let me go back to this via here. I'm going to right click on this via and I'm going to do find similar objects. So the left, or the leftmost column, is for the specific properties of the via. The middle column is for are the properties or the values of these properties for the via that I selected. And then lastly over here, I have whether I want to make something that is same or any. Any basically is kind of what you call a don't care. And what I want to show you over here is, let's say for instance, I want to have a via, and I want to select those vias that do have a via diameter of 24. So I'm going to make that the same, and the hole size of 12. So I'll make that the same as well. Okay, and of course I could turn on a few other ones just to make it kind of fun here. Here's the solder mask expansion. Let's turn that one on too, because I want to show you what ultimately Altium's going to come back to the filter panel and show that to me. The one thing you've got to do, however, in order for it to actually show you the query, is you got to turn on create expression. The zoom matching, selected, clear existing, all of these over here, the exact same things that you saw here in the filter panel as well. Okay, even the mask here. So I'm going to click apply. The only difference between apply and OK is that it gives you a preview of what it's going to select. And this looks pretty good. It's zoomed out and it's found a lot of things that look like the via of that nature. And I'm going to press OK. And you may have noticed here on the filter panel that now it's actually giving me this query. And it's come up with some pretty interesting query compilations here, or various aspects of it. The one thing I'll mention, and I don't want to go into this too deep because the time's moving on here. However, you'll notice something called as mills. This is really an important feature of the query language. Altium did not have to put as mills here. It could have just said via diameter equals 24. But if you're working between mils and millimeters, mm, then it's good to be very specific with Altium as to what this 24 represents, because you don't put a label at the end of it. It just wants a number. And that's why they have this feature called as mills. And there's another one called as mm as well. So there you go with the filter panel. One of the way to come across things, so you can use the filter panel itself to try to build this query. You can also, and of course, find similar objects, but you can also use the builder. And I have to admit, of all of them, I like the builder the most because it's the most fundamental and the easiest one to do. So if I'm looking for a particular component, I just have to look in this list over here and it says, oh, it belongs to a component. So, okay, let's say for instance, I want D1. I go in here and I do this. Actually, I want to change something a little bit here because I want to bring another point up. I'm going to actually go to a net. Let's say I want to go to a net and I have a ground. And I said, that's great. I want net ground. And I'm going to add another condition in here and I want another net and I want to find VCC. So the intention here is that I want it to find, Altium didn't like that. Let's try that one more time. What I want to do here is I want to have a rule that's going to try to find the either ground or VCC. So let's go back over here to the builder. There we go. So let's try this again. So I'm going to say it's going to belong to this net. I'm going to say ground. That's great. And I'm going to do another condition. So let's again do to net, and we will do VCC. Click on this here, and then I will press OK. Okay, there we go. So we do have this. And if I press, I'm going to clear this out here. And if I press apply to all, this will fail. Why is that? Because one little tricky thing about the builder that people miss is this little conjunction that is used. What this is saying here is that I'm looking for something that is both ground and both VCC, and there are no primitives out there that can have two or more nets associated with them. So in order to fix this, I got to go back into the, well, I could fix this in the builder just to show what has to be done here, or I can fix it over here as well. So here I'm going to build it together again. So I've got my ground. I'm going to build another condition again to the net, and I will do VCC. Okay. Oh, come on. Well, the point I was trying to make is that once you have the builder up here, I won't press OK with this. I'll just show it. And then we do another condition. Hopefully it won't crash again. Make sure that the and is changed over to an or. That's the thing here, is that automatically it puts it to an and people miss this. And sometimes you actually have to have an or condition. But if I do change this to an or and I run this now, it should, let's do a clear here, and then we do apply all, and it's now found all those things that are either ground or VCC. So different ways to do it, okay? I do have a question for you. Time just moves so quick when I'm trying to get through a lot over here. I do have a polling question for you. The question is, if we were to do a query language webinar, would you be interested in it? Okay, so about 75% of you, actually a very large percent of you is either saying yes or maybe. I'd be kind of curious about the maybes as to what you guys would look for in terms of something specific. So I'd like to know what you're looking for to get that maybe to a yes, but it sounds like something for us to definitely pursue, and that's great. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to change gears and I'm going to talk about classes because they're really important here. So I'm going to hit clear here, and classes, really what classes are buckets. And the nice part about a class is that instead of typing something like innet ground or innet VCC, the intention over here is to basically put together a class so that we can just call out that class and be done with it. And there's a number of different classes over here that we can make use of. It dawned on me, and I do apologize, before I go into classes, there's one more thing I wanted to show you, and that was the regional rule, because here I'm going to make use of the filter panel for this situation. So let me put together the regional rule. It'll take me about 2 minutes to show you that. So what if I want to create a rule that is specific to a local region? So here, I want to create a rule here that says, hey, you know what? I'm willing to have a different set of criteria for the clearance rule. Can I do that? And the answer is yes. In order to do that, you got to add in a room. So let me go through the motions of that here. We don't go into place for a room. Oddly enough, we go into design and we go into rooms and we'll place a room. So I'm going to drop this down over here. There we go. We've got that in here as such. And you can see that because I drew this in here, now we get all of our error messages coming up, which is perfectly fine because it ran the DRC. The online DRC was run as a result of that. I'm going to double click into it. Notice that the properties that come up, let me cancel this because I want to make sure you guys see this. When I click on the for properties, there's nothing here. When I double click into it, the weird part about a room is that it's actually a part of the rule set. And the only thing I need to do with this over here is just give it a good name. So this is, I'll say, the U1 region, because I want to be able to find it here afterwards, and I'll press OK. So now this region now exists. When it comes to this, this particular type of rule, as I mentioned earlier on, again, we keep going back to this. So room is one of those things where I don't want to say is room, because if I click on is room, the problem with this is, pardon me, go to, let's turn those off. And there we go. So where is room? The problem with is room is that I'm not trying to compare against the room itself. I'm trying to compare about those things that are in the room. So there's a different terminology for it, and it's called within room. So I'm going to click on within room, and the one nice thing is that it does pop up a list of those rooms that do exist. And boom, I've got it here. And just to show you how to create the rule, I'm going to go create the rule and go through the motions here. I want a clearance rule. I'll press OK. And boom, there it is. There is my room here, and I can give it whatever value I want to give it. So let's say if I want to give this one 25, I can actually, let's make this smaller so we can see that it actually has an impact on it. And also I'll call this one, we'll call it the room as well so we can see this. There's several other things I'm going to show you here in just a few moments. So we've got our room, we've got our clearance room, we're calling it 25. Let's take the look at the priorities, and it is priority 1. That's great. And I press OK and I'm done. Okay. In order for me to show you the results of this, I do have to run it one more time. So I'm going to go into Tools, Design Error Markers. Pardon me, not reset them. I'm going to go to Design Rule Check, and I'm going to run this. Now, we are going to get a bunch of errors, but this is primarily due to the fact of the shell polygon. But the point I want to show you here, after I get this off my window, is go back over here to this. Here, the point I want to show you is that the number of errors over here have been drastically reduced. Now, some of them are still errors, but like, for example, this line over here, if we right click, go to violations, you'll see the clearance constraint between the top layer. Some of these have to do with the fact that they are going out a little bit further beyond the room itself. And some of them have to do with the fact that the polygon is shelved. So that's why you see some of these here. And there's other situations where the width rule is impacting things. So even though I said for the clearance rule, anything in here as a rule change, it didn't necessarily impact the other rules as well, because we only did it for the clearance rule. So that's why I wanted to bring this to your attention and just kind of round out our work here in the PCB filter. So let me now jump over to classes. So in the classes here, as I mentioned earlier on, the whole point of these classes is to put things into buckets, and they're not mutually exclusive. So for example, if we look at the net class here, I've created some. So here's one that what it does is it gives you the entire list of everything in the net list, and then you just pick on those things that you want to have to be members of it. So I created this one here, and I created one called signals over here. Now, you'll notice something over here. Here I just had ground and VCC. This one over here has a couple of other nets plus ground and VCC to it. So you can create as many of these net classes which you want, and you can have the same net be in all of these different classes, which is somewhat useful, but also somewhat dangerous. The reason why this can be a little bit dangerous, so I want you to be careful about doing this type of thing, is, for example, if we go into the rules, let's go into design rules, and we go into this clearance rule. So here are my clearance rules over here, and you'll see that I did actually create two classes, one of them that use the net class power and the other one that uses the signal. One of them has 5 and the other one has 30. So what will happen is that, let's say for instance, I do want my power and my ground to be at 30, but I promote this one over here because I actually don't mind the grounds being a clearance of 5 mils. So if I actually promote this one, so let's go to priorities here and I promote it. Let's take this one and I increase the priority. Well, what's going to happen now is that this one also has power in it, and it's no longer adhering to this clearance rule of 30 mils, is now adhering to the clearance rule of 5 mils. This is the biggest problem I've seen with these net classes or classes in general. You start creating a whole bunch of rules, you start creating classes kind of without really thinking about what you're putting in them, and you'll promote one, and as a result of you promoting it, you fix one thing and you break another. So just be careful when you are creating these net classes here, because you can have, again, the same net being in different net classes. Nevertheless, they're still very useful. And by the way, if you create a class, you don't have to use it. So Altium is more than happy to create some classes for you. Anything in the brackets here means that Altium will make those available for you automatically. So for example, if I had things in the bottom side components, I could use this as a part of the query and I'd see those things that were on the bottom side. I wouldn't have to go in, for example, and say, oh shoot, I flipped this to the bottom side. Now I've got to go in and fix the class in order to update it. You don't have to do that. Altium would take care of that for you. You can create any of these classes that you want. Of course, I'd say the vast majority of the ones that get created are the ones here for the net class and those here for the component classes. And I have seen some of these other ones used, but it does take me to a polling question that I want to ask you. I'm kind of curious to see if anybody has used some of these classes that are in there, like the design channel class, the structure classes, and so on and so forth. And you can click more than one. So we're showing the results over here. So a lot of people have used the layer classes. That one really doesn't surprise me, since especially with larger boards with multiple layers, then you could certainly control a lot more things in the rules doing that. The channel class, I could see that as well, though I'd like to get a little more, for those people who selected the channel class or the from to class or even the structure class, if you have an opportunity, either send me an email or write in the question panel as to what specifically you're using it for, because I'd like to know the use case scenarios for those. I know how to put them together. Pretty much all the classes are the same way. It's just I'd like to see the use case to really bring home why they would be used on that. So you can see that all these classes do exist here. They're pretty much based off of the primitive type. So obviously layer classes are based on the layers, the pads are based on the pads. The from to class is kind of an interesting thing. I don't have a lot of time to go into it. Let me cancel out here. But in the PCB panel, there is this thing called the from to editor. And in the from to editor, if this was an unrouted board, I can basically brute force the rat's nest for certain things. So I can create daisy chains and I can create starbursts and other things like that as well. And so I guess if there's enough of these here, you can actually combine these from to declarations into a single class there. So that's why I'm kind of curious to see what people have used those things for. It'd be good to know. Let me go back over here to designs and the classes. There's also the structure class too. I think a lot of people are making use of this one as well. This one's basically a class of classes. And for example, if we click on this one I created called Neo9 here, if I was to create a component class, it would also become available here. But basically the idea behind this structure class is that instead of doing a regional rule, maybe there are certain signals, I don't care where they go on the board, but they have to adhere to certain things, maybe a clock signal, for example. And so those things as a result could be, whether it's in a trace or an arc or a component, I want there to be special rules for that. So you can basically create these other classes. They'll be listed over here, and then you can add those here as members to it. So that's what you can do with that. here. For the sake of time, the one thing I'll just show you is there's a feature that a lot of people overlook. It's a really cool one. It's a selection feature, and I will do that here for the component classes. So let me cancel out. One of the features that you can use to create a class is by selecting something. So again, I'm going to go to Find Similar Objects, and I selected D3 because I want these RGB LEDs. So I'm going to click Same on this over here, and I'm going to press OK. And these now have all been selected. Of course, if you ever want to, just take a look at your filter panel, see how Altium responded with the query on that. But nevertheless, in the design, in the classes, I'm going to go here to component classes, and I'm going to add a class. All of them work the same way. You just right-click on it, add the class, give it a new name. So I'm going to call this one RGB LED. Okay. And you'll notice that there's a feature turned on over here. Well, what is this feature here? It means those things that you selected, I click on it, anything that had been selected here, primarily through the Find Similar Objects. Sometimes you can just select and come here too, but I find the Find Similar Objects works the best with this particular feature. You select it, and now all those things have become their own members, and I now have a new class. One side note, in the structure class, what I have found is if you create a new class somewhere else, you have to, after you're done creating it, you've got to press OK, and then go back into design classes, so that if you want to add a structure class, it now becomes available. And as I mentioned, it doesn't matter if it's a net class or a component class or any other type of class. The whole idea between the structure class is to represent all those things that may be of importance for this particular signal or part of the board. Okay, where I want to go with this next is on the schematic side, because there's always questions about, well, what about those things I can create on the schematic side? So I'm going to bring up the schematic for this this design here, and I'll show you a few things. Hopefully you're familiar with these. If not, good review of them. There's what are called directives, and Altium did a good job cleaning up directives. In the past, there used to be a big old pile of these things, and they pretty much cleaned them up in Altium Designer 18. So you go into Place, Directives, and what you'd want to do is put down something called Parameter Set. And you'll have that on your cursor here. I'll drop it down, right-click so we can take a look at the properties. What the parameter set does is they allow you to create rules within the schematic. But what I want to focus is on the classes here. So I can also create a class over here as well. And it's really just a matter of just clicking on Add, and then you add in a class name. And as long as you add this to all those nets, Altium will eventually generate the as one of its ECO operations will actually generate that net class. Now you can put one on each and every net, and that's what I did over here for VCC, well, in ground. But there's also another feature, because let's say, for instance, you've got a lot of nets and you don't want to put one on for each and every single one of them. About a decade ago, Altium introduced something that a lot of people didn't realize. It's called a blanket. And the blanket is under the Place Directives manual as well. You don't want to use compile mask. Compile mask is used for SPICE simulation. And it's one of those things where if you're doing SPICE simulation, you're swapping out parts. If you leave them exposed, then the compilation will not complete. So you've got to bury them under a compile mask. Or if there's an area of your design that is not ready to be compiled, you can actually put this under a compile mask as well. But what we are using here is the blanket. And when you place down the blanket, you simply draw it about. And so I put a blanket over all of these. And all you need to do is put the directive right on top of the blanket. So all of these nets that fall within this blanket will fall under this class called LED nets. Okay, so there it is right there for you. Okay, so there's the nets. Now, what about components? Components are handled in a different way. So you have to remember that in Altium, these wires here, let's click on a wire, they have very few properties to them. So a lot of times you got to attach things to them, like a net name. Directives are no different. But when it comes to classes for components, it has to become a parameter. So I'm going to click on D2, and I've already again set this up just for the sake of time here. But all of these RGB LEDs have they have a variable called class name. This is a key variable. You have to use this name, class name, and then the value. So of course you could have something else that has a class name with a different value, and that would be another type of class here. But there you go. You have class name, and there's the value of it. Now, before I do an ECO to push this over, one of the things that I want to bring to your attention is how do we prevent Altium from doing the stomp job on what we've already set up in the on the PCB side. So there we've got to go to project options. want to go to class generation here first. Make sure that this gets turned on. This is not turned on by default, generate net classes. So if you don't have this turned on here, any of the directives that you have will be ignored. So make sure that gets turned on. Same thing with these component classes because they're called user-defined classes. And yes, for each sheet, you can always turn this on as well. And for each sheet that you've got, it will create a class for that automatically. And by the way, for buses, Altium will do that as well. But for our purposes, we user define these. I want these to go over to the PCB side. There is this thing called the comparator and this thing called the ECO generation. And you may say, why did they split these things up? The reason they did it is because there really is two aspects to a compilation. The first thing that it's trying to do is trying to compare and contrast those things that are different between what's on the schematic net list and on the PCB net list. If you turn these things off over here, it won't look for it. So as a matter of fact, if I didn't have a net list, or pardon me, a net class, and I added it in afterwards, and I turned off add or change net class here, it won't find it, and it won't even try to ECO it. Where the problems really come in is I do want it to create it or to recognize that there is a difference. It's the ECO generation of removing things. Okay, so if I have something like component class names, I don't want the class names to be changed. I don't want the channel class members to be changed, or to remove the channel classes, or to remove the component classes. So it's key that this area here gets changed, not the comparator tab, because ultimately these will end up showing on the ECO if you say, hey, generate the orders for it. All too often we miss it and then we blow it away. So that's what I've done here is I said, look, whatever ones that I've got, don't try to remove them. And for the ones that I'm going to introduce, I'm okay with that because I'm going to say, hey, compare against them and create them if they're there. So let's press OK here and just demonstrate that. So if we go into our design update from our update to the PCB here, I'm not going to try to match these, but what I want to show you is notice that it's not trying to modify and it's not trying to delete. It's trying to add a component class here and it's trying to add a net class here. And because one of mine happened to have a rule in here, it's going to add in a rule as well. So I'll execute the changes. And finally, with that, let's go over to design just to show you what happened here. In my classes, I still have the ones I originally created because they didn't get stomped on. I also have the new one that I asked for that was placed under the blanket. Not really sure what happened to the power one here, but nevertheless, the one that was under the blanket did get created. There is also this one, the LEDs from the schematic. Interestingly enough, the ones I must have selected were the U's and not the D's. But there they are, because here are the ones for the ones on the PCB side of it. So I was able to preserve those here. I have come to the end of the hour over here. I have one more polling question for you. So if you don't mind, if you can take a moment to grade me, I'd appreciate it. Great. Well, I appreciate the responses over here. I'm glad this was relevant for what everybody needs. I'm always trying to guess to see what people know or what they don't know. And I know that this was probably overwhelming for a good number of you. I only got an hour to push a lot of information at you. And I can't tell you for every one thing I did show you, there's about 10 I couldn't show you. So it's really frustrating to me to not show you those things as well. So with that, two things. If you have questions, please continue to write those in. We'll take a look at those. And if you got a moment, let me just talk a little bit about 9.connects here. So let's click on this here. You're here for a reason today, and that's because you want to see some new query features that Altium has added in, or you want to see existing features or enhanced features, or you're just new to Altium and you want a better understanding of rule creation. Hopefully it gave you a good idea of how to go about that with the queries. What do we do here at 9.connects? We do training and services. And one of the things that we have done as of late is boot camp. We've done it for quite a while, but we've completely redesigned it. It's been written for Altium Designer 18 and 19, and hopefully going forward, they won't make too many major changes to it. But the big thing is it's now project-based, and this is something that we think is really important. It's one thing to learn a tool. It's another thing to learn something based off of what you would actually do with the tool. So it's really for those who are familiar with those tools. So it can serve for those who are familiar with the tool. So if you've been using the tool for a while, but you want a good refresher, the best time to do it. Sometimes we find that some of the best students that we have are those who maybe done one or two boards with it. So they have a general feel for Altium Designer, but want to definitely understand some of the features a little bit deeper. Those things you've forgotten, overlooked. We also talk about things like configuration for templates as well. Sometimes for those who are new, that's kind of the last thing they want to see, but of course we show that because that's a part of the introductory course. And it's all taught by those who are well-versed in PCB design. And there, as I say, support for tricky questions. I get them all the time. So if it's not me or Sean or our other instructor, Eric, sometime or another, someone will ask one of those questions that really stumps us. We do contact each other to try to get a question to those who have asked them during the camp. We want to make sure you walk away with everything answered. So for more information, certainly take a look at us at 9.connects, look under our training, and you'll also see a little video there as well. So that is the end of the hour. Again, I want to thank you so much for coming here today. It's always a pleasure to pass along my knowledge to my fellow Altium colleagues and users. Stay tuned for our next webinar announcement. And with that, you guys have a wonderful day.